Welcome. I'm Glenn Anderson with the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation. For more than 26 years, this TV series has explored a wide variety of issues that relate to peace, social justice, and nonviolent social change. The science is settled. The climate crisis is real. And human behavior, burning wood, and more recently especially fossil fuels, has caused it. This month's TV program goes past the obvious causes to examine some causes that are not usually recognized. And these unrecognized sources of the problem are also unrecognized solutions. During this hour, we will explore social and economic justice, real imbalances of power as part of the problem. And we'll explore how correcting the imbalances of social and economic power can help reduce the climate crisis. Our guest, Gar Lippo, is a researcher and writer with wide-ranging knowledge across very diverse subject matter. He's highly skilled at connecting the dots across issues to identify problems and propose solutions. He's written several books, including Solving the Climate Crisis Through Social Change, which we'll refer to tonight in this conversation. It'll be a fascinating hour, and we will learn a lot. I'm delighted to welcome Gar Lippo as a guest. Good to have you here. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
All right. Let's start with an example that we might draw a lesson from in a bit later. When a house or apartment is not well insulated, heat leaks out and it wastes energy. When we burn fuel to reheat the house or apartment, we waste fuel and put more carbon dioxide, CO2, into the atmosphere, and this disrupts the climate. Many apartment buildings are poorly insulated. What are the realities for the tenant and for the apartment owner?
For the tenant, there's the fact that no tenant knows for sure how long they're going to stay. So a tenant doesn't want to make a huge investment in insulation that could just end up being a gift to the landlord. And the reality for the landlord is the landlord doesn't want to make a investment that would save the tenant money. So you end up with what's called a split incentive, where neither the tenant nor the landlord has enough incentive to properly insulate that apartment.
Okay, so people can stash that away in their minds, and I want to see, can we generate another example on the same principle, and people can store that in their minds until we can connect the dots.
Okay, well, it's also true that houses that are owner-occupied are often under-insulated. And a reason for that is that a homeowner doesn't have as easy access to capital as a utility. So a utility can borrow money at a very low interest rate. A homeowner will often have to borrow money at a much higher rate. And in addition, because a homeowner has limited ability to borrow, they have to say, hey, wait a minute, what if the roof leaks? What if I lose my job? All the possibilities. And so homeowners are reluctant to borrow money and add to their debt to produce savings over the long run. And if you don't mind, that doesn't apply just to homeowners, but in general, even applies to businesses too. Businesses cannot afford to spend as much to save energy as a utility can afford to spend to generate it.
Okay, so different entities have different constraints, incentives, different financial realities. Let's look at something that's in a different angle, and the viewers can stash that away in their minds until we connect the dots a bit later. Tell us about the short-handled hoe that lettuce farmers used to require farm workers to use. Short-handled hoe is, for anybody who's doing work in the yard, a hoe that you can stand up on of a normal length is one thing, but a hoe that's so short you have to stoop over is awful.
The short-handled hoe is called El Cortito, the devil's arm. It was 18 inches long. And so to pull lettuce with that farm workers, to pull weeds in the lettuce fields, farm workers had to bend and stoop. And it caused horrible back injuries, lifelong back injuries. A lawyer representing the farm workers tried it and had to see what it was like and had to give up after a few hours. He couldn't stand the pain. So the UFW, United Farm Workers Union, led a movement to outlaw the short-handled hoe in the lettuce fields. And the lettuce growers said, hey, wait a minute, you outlaw the short-handled hoe, we'll go bankrupt. The lettuces won't be weeded right. But the farm workers won, and here's an interesting thing. The day the short-handled hoe was outlawed, Bud Antle, the major lettuce grower at the time, admitted productivity went up 10%. So the important thing here, of course, is not that productivity went up 10%, but that hideous cruelty was ended. But it's interesting that happened because one of the side effects was that if lettuces were weeded more efficiently, that it turned out that you're not wasting pesticides growing lettuces that have to be thrown away, damaged. You're not wasting truck fuel because it takes truck fuel to get farm workers from the labor camps to the fields, fertilizer, and so on. And so it actually saved emissions. No one was thinking about that, but it did. But an interesting thing is, why did the lettuce growers not know that this would happen? Well, because they were thinking about control. The thing about the short-handled hoe is it's fundamentally an instrument of control. When you use it, the supervisors can see the farm workers' back muscles ripple. And if they pause even for a second, the muscles relax, and the supervisor, the field boss, can see that they're slacking. So it gives very detailed control. With the long-handled hoe, the field boss can't see it. But of course, what they didn't take into consideration is that the workers are not in tremendous pain. So they can also, so if you're not hurting while you're working, you can also work more effectively, even if they don't have as much control over your work.
Yeah. So this would be like totally unexpected, and is there some other example you could think of that deals with implications for the climate when people suffer from either social or economic injustice?
Well, if you want something very close to this, early, and it wasn't so much injustice as a matter of control again, is early computerization in a wood pulp factory. Workers were given, it was one of the first factories ever to be computerized, and management, just out of curiosity, gave workers access to all the information that the computer was keeping track of. And the workers said, hey, we're noticing that there are lots of expenses, and we can save some of those expenses. So there was no special program or incentive put in place, but just that they had the information. They saw ways of saving expenses by cutting down water use, by cutting down chemical use, by applying them more, by timing things right. And so they ended up reducing the amount of water that had to be used, the amount of chemicals that had to be used, which saved the company money. And as a side effect, of course, it takes emissions to pump water. It takes emissions to make chemicals. So it also cut emissions in the pulping practice. But the interesting thing is management, when they saw them workers cutting expenses, said, the reaction was, let's cut off access to the information. And somebody interviewed, why did you cut them back? And the middle management says, well, saving costs is our job. If workers can go ahead and cut the costs without needing us, what is anybody going to need us for? And so in this case, it was a middle management. And so that was a case, so that's an interesting case where you had a conflict of interest, not so much between, in this case, between middle management and workers. And so wasn't a question so much of injustice, but of control, again, of control.
Which is probably unjust as well. But here the employees were trying to do the right thing, and they were being smart and using information available, and indirectly saving
Yes.
emissions and so forth, as well as other resources. Let's look at something that is widely believed in our society to be true, which is markets know how to allocate resources efficiently, that markets can make things as efficient as possible and eliminate waste. And you've pointed out that markets can be very inefficient and even wasteful. Can you tell us something that we need to know about markets?
Well, I mean, one of the things is that you have to understand that infrastructure seldom comes from markets to begin with. If you think historically, the post office, the early canals, railroads, all of our roads today, the internet, all of them initially came into being with large amounts of public investment. Sometimes that investment was in the form of grants of land, right-of-ways, other ways it was actually...
public is government investment.
Government investment,
Yeah,
yes. Sometimes it was rights of way, sometimes it was money. And so one thing to look at is infrastructure doesn't happen through markets. Markets, once you've got the infrastructure, may take advantage of it, but infrastructure begins with government. Another thing is to look there are all sorts of ways because ultimately markets give rewards based on power. And so a lot of things, decisions are made based on power rather than on efficiency. I'll give you an example of this is labor. And when you're talking about investments, businesses typically will demand about 5 times as high a rate of return on investment to save energy or resources as they will on investment to save labor. In other words, businesses will take advantage of a less profitable opportunity to save labor over a more profitable opportunity to save water or to save energy.
Do they have just like an inherent incentive as business owners to try to hold labor down?
They do, because here's the thing, and here's the difference, is I think fundamentally what happens is that energy and water does not go on strike. Workers do. And so if you're a business owner, the fundamental incentive is, yes, you may save less money in the short run, in some cases, saving labor, but in the long run, you're increasing your leverage, and down the road, you've got more leverage. When times get bad, you've got more ability to lay people off. When times get good, you have more ability not to raise wages.
Yeah. So it's the leverage, it's the power differential, whereas an element from the natural world like water or a raw material does not have its own interests.
Right.
It doesn't have a consciousness.
Right, and the point is, if you're a business, the people who sell you the water have their own interests, but the thing is, they're large compared to, if you're an owner, you deal with the workers in your firm. If you're dealing with a water supplier, that's a huge water supplier, and cutting your water bill doesn't give you any leverage over your water utility, whereas cutting your labor costs give you leverage over those workers. And another thing to understand is it's not so much necessarily that most businesses are aware of this directly. Some may be, but also it's in the business culture where saving energy or water is kind of thought of as fuzzy and green, where saving labor that's macho, and that's good management.
Yeah, real managers, cut labor costs. Yeah. So let's pull together some of these thoughts that we played with early on about the apartment, the home insulation, and the short-handled hoe, and so forth. We talked about these things a few minutes ago, and some of these things we talked about were what you've referred to as atomization, the landlord-tenant issue in the apartment, or even the homeowner. Tell us about the concept of atomization and how it can make the climate crisis worse. And you've got a quotation from one of these books that you wrote that lays it out pretty clearly. If
Yeah,
you could
let me read
read
that. Actually, let
please.
me actually read that to you.
Yes, that's
Many
great.
of the market flaws that lead to climate change stem from atomization. We act without information or incentives that encourage us to take the effects of our action on others into consideration. We forget or are not even given the tools to consider that we are all members of one another.
Okay.
And
so,
I would add the other thing is inequality, those power differentials, because the costs and benefits get divided very unevenly.
so these things will unwittingly hurt the climate.
Yes.
And hurt their use of resources, and that very often leads to climate damage. So it's not like somebody is setting out saying, I want to find a way to hurt the climate. They're trying to figure out, how can I have some more leverage over my employees? And unwittingly, that results in inefficiencies and waste that hurts the climate.
Or it's or other things, yes. Or how can I have more leverage over, or it's the fact that the existing inequality in the landlord-tenant, it's you already have that inequality between landlord and tenant. That causes the split incentive. So it's not a case of seeking more leverage. It's a result of the leverage that's already there.
Yeah, and I think we'll see during this hour, one of the things I like so much about the book that I read half a year ago that you wrote, Solving the Climate Crisis Through Social Change, I like very much the notion that these problems that we see in the system, the infrastructure, the way things function, are both the problems leading to climate problems, and also, if we were to address those injustices, the power differentials, that would actually help the climate. And there's this interplay between problem and solution that I just find fascinating, and it's all well documented. Can you tell us some more about how climate change and social power differentials or social injustice can interact?
Yes, and it's one example. A very good one is the you can think of the wind farms off Cape Wind versus toxic waste plants in Ohio. In Cape Wind, for the past 10 years, there's this company that's been trying to build wind generators offshores, and they have been stopped by very powerful people, including Mitt Romney and the Kennedys.
This is off of Massachusetts.
Martha's Vineyard.
Yeah, very rich area on
richest,
Massachusetts.
most powerful people, yeah. Senators, top billionaires, the Koch brothers, you name a lever of power, it seems like they've got a home there. And they don't want to look at wind generators miles and miles away from their home, the size of a thumb, through their picture windows. They don't want them there, and so they've been able to stop them. Meanwhile, if you go into Ohio, into this little town in Ohio, there's a WTI, and WTI is a company name, and I don't has a toxic waste incinerator that's right next to a school and a bunch of homes, and they've been trying to stop it for 10 years, and they have cancer and all sorts of things, and they haven't been able to. So, in the one hand, you can't people without the people. So you've got these mostly African American and Latino working class people who can't even stop a toxic waste generator, and you've got the people, rich people in Martha's Vineyard, who won't even tolerate clean, really harmless energy because they don't want to look at the wind generators.
Yeah, there's a whole movement around environmental justice that has been able to document very, very clearly that toxic waste dumps end up almost entirely in poor neighborhoods next to Indian reservations and so forth, and that the worst oil refineries and petrochemical plants down around Houston and the Gulf Coast of Louisiana and all that are in very poor, often minority neighborhoods.
Right.
It's just overwhelming. They never put those in. There will never be a toxic waste dump on Mercer Island.
Right. But the thing to understand is it also creates emissions, because on the one hand, we have the example where this clean wind plant is not being built, and on the other hand, if you had more equality, so that there were no really poor areas to put these in, you'd have to make them a heck of a lot cleaner. You'd face the pressure. So again, the technical, you still have the technical thing going on, the direct cause of the emissions, but socially, it's an effect of inequality that you're getting all these emissions.
Yeah. Let's talk for a bit about ways to address the climate crisis in very practical ways through investing public money, the governmental money, the money that we all share as a society. And you've been able to connect the dots in your research when you call for public governmental investment as a practical way to deal with it, and simultaneously make our society more fair. And it's like, whoa, this is what we need. Tell us about that approach.
Well, you can start with the fact that, as I said earlier, infrastructure always happens with public investment. Again, our automobile, our highly polluting infrastructure we have now came through government spending. And if you want clean infrastructure, you're going to need large-scale public investment. You're going to need wind turbines, and even though we've got a growing wind energy, on the scale we need it's not going to happen without large-scale public investment. You're going to need solar, and again, whether you're talking about concentrating solar power in the desert or solar cells on people's roof, it's not going to happen on a large enough scale to really start replacing coal unless you have large-scale public investment. You're going to, other things, you're going to need transmission. Again, public investment. You're going to need either electric cars or electric passenger trains, or maybe both. And again, that's public investment. You're going to need storage, public investment. You're going to need efficiency, and a lot of that's going to happen with public investment.
And we've done that before. As you said, the subsidy for the automobile came about in a number of ways, but one that I remember was when Eisenhower proposed and pushed through Congress the national freeway system, what became the freeway system, and people don't realize that they couldn't get it through as a transportation item, but they marketed that through Congress and even named the bill as the National Defense Highway System. And the rationalization was, if we ever need to mobilize for war and get a whole bunch of tanks and military vehicles from one state to another, we got to have a clean shot through and not have to stop at traffic lights in all the small towns along the way. So they built freeways with the rationalization that way we can move tanks and other military vehicles around. It was really a transportation thing, but they couldn't sell it through Congress as a transportation. It had to be for national defense.
And
then it went.
And we still have today, that there's lots of rules and ways parking is provided on streets at low cost or free, and parking requirements for building, and so on. And it ends up that there are statistics out there that typically your average automobile gets $4,000 worth of parking subsidies, either free or below cost parking a year. So that's an example of massive public. So your automobile, whether you realize it or not, is being subsidized to the tune of $4,000 a year in parking.
Yeah, and that money could have been spent to subsidize a better bus system or
light rail,
electric trolleys, light rail, all kinds of things. But instead it goes to this. And it comes through the private sector. It comes through all kinds of ways that offer free parking. And then probably there's no topic that's gotten more letters to the editor of the local Olympia newspaper than people complaining about not enough parking downtown. It's like, this has been going on for years and years, and it's like, we've got the bus system that's been rated one of the best in the country, and still people complain about, if they can't park right in front of the store they want to visit. I know we got this cultural stuff that needs to move. Anyway, where would we find money for public investment? How would we find,
Several places. One is the fact that we could tax the rich more, and even the upper middle class. We have, our wealthy are taxed less than almost in any other country in the world. Another case is we could have what's known as a Tobin tax, and that is basically, or sometimes called the Robin Hood tax. It's a sales tax on financial transactions. Like if you buy a stock and sell a stock, each time a 0.5% cost. And the advantage of that is if you just buy and sell stock, if you just buy up a stock once, that isn't very much money. But if you're one of these investors that are speculating and you buy it hundreds of times, then that gets into real money, which means that it slows down the speculation and it helps prevent bubbles like the one that led to the last financial. And when Tobin first proposed this and won the Nobel Prize for it, he was saying is, look, our financial system is too frictionless. It leads to bubbles. We need to put some sand in the gears. And so that's actually, so aside from the money, and a Tobin tax would generate about $500 billion a year, but it also would help prevent a lot of these bubbles. I mean, it's not by itself enough, but it would sure help. There are a lot of things you have to do if you want to prevent bubbles. But a Tobin tax, a Robin Hood tax, would help a lot in preventing it. Another thing is, you know, we spend as much on our military as almost everyone else in the world combined. We don't need to have thousands of military bases all over the world to be in Iraq, in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, and we're in lots of places in Africa, and most people don't know we are involved in the Philippines. All sorts of, I mean, we're involved in so many places in the world, I don't think I could easily make a complete list of it. And that's something that would provide a good source of money. Is to spend a lot less on the military.
And in fact, related to that is the military is an enormous user of fossil fuels, an enormous contributor toward greenhouse gases and the climate crisis. I mean, the military is notorious for having gas-guzzling vehicles. I remember during the Vietnam War, somebody had done some research to figure out how much petroleum was that was consuming, and it turned out that the United States was using as much petroleum just for the Vietnam War as the entire nation of Sweden was using for all of their transportation, industrial, home heating, industrial, I mean everything.
But the big thing is, the big thing about the military is that it competes for infrastructure. Because, for example, because if you're looking at absolute use, yes, it's large, but as a percentage, we use more meat consumption in the United States produces more emissions than the military. I can think of a lot of things that do, but the big thing is that the military is capital intensive. And historically, there have been a lot of cases where we've made choices to fund the military and to, or where rather than fund things. For instance, back in the 40s, Buckminster Fuller had what he called the Dymaxion House. And this was a house that would have met today's LEED Platinum standards. LEED Platinum is one of the most efficient standards a building can have today. Well, that building back in the day would have been mass produced, would have met what is today's LEED Platinum energy standards. And Walter Reuther and the trade union movement was very enthusiastic. They said, this could be,
with the United Auto Workers.
This could be the next automobile industry. We could mass produce houses the way we produce automobiles and more jobs for everybody. But he was defeated because they said, hey, wait a minute, we want to produce missiles. So Reuther wanted to convert the military into producing the military factories, into producing these homes. But instead you had the money go into a new Cold War after World War II ended. So that was a case, and so that was a direct conflict where money went into military instead of into something that would have made life better and reduced emissions.
And we've got a lot of those kinds of cases where I had done a lot of research on this and wrote a substantial report back in 76, 77 about this kind of stuff and converting and how it's so much better for jobs if we get away from the military, which is, like you say, is capital intensive. It soaks up a lot of money, but without producing as many jobs per $1 billion as a whole lot of other kinds of spending. And there's been recent research on this coming out of one of the prestigious academic centers in Massachusetts with new data, new economic data showing that education would produce vastly more jobs per $1 billion than the military, and other civilian purposes would as well. So the money is out there. And
it's not just a question of jobs, but it's also true, you know, if you put the money In the military, what you've got is a missile, which you can't eat, you can't drive. Whereas you put the money into something civilian, you also have a good produced for the money.
Right, right. Yeah, people need education, people need healthcare, people need libraries and local transportation and all kinds of things that people actually need. Whereas if you use the missile, you end up killing folks.
And there's something else to understand about this, and that is that it's also important to understand that this kind of public investment produces prosperity. It's not just a question that it's, the fact that it's important for the climate is important alone, but especially if we get it at the expense of the rich, if we have more, if we do it in a way that produces more equality. Because one of the things that happens with inequality is it produces bubbles. Look, you're an investor, you're a rich person, you're an investor, you're always looking for a place to invest. So what happens if more money is going to the rich? Well, first of all, they've got more money to invest. But second of all, what are they going to invest in? Well, you've got fewer people who can buy things. So you've also got less money out there, fewer investment opportunities. And the thing is, even though rich people buy fancy cars and things, one Jaguar does not produce as many jobs, isn't as much demand as 100 Fords. There's a lot more demand in buying 100 Fords than there is in buying one Jaguar. So what happens is you've got fewer investment opportunities. So what do? Well, investors start getting conned. They start falling for bubbles. For instance, this whole mortgage bubble that caused that was the proximate cause of the last crash. What happened? Well, a mortgage is a valid, genuinely, legitimately low-risk mortgage is a really good investment. People don't like to default on their homes. It's paying off your mortgage is a priority. But what happened is the demand for those mortgages exceeded the supplies. So they started doing tricks to create things that looked like legitimate mortgages that weren't. And that was because you had this huge demand for from investors due to this inequality. And I can think of all sorts of other bubbles, but the same thing happens. You have something that's a legitimate demand investment. There isn't enough of it for all the people who want to invest. So people create artificial, basically, whether it's sometimes illegally, sometimes legally, but things that look like the same type of investment but isn't.
Right, and so this became the casino economy because people were gambling on bets like they're creating, in order to soak up that money that was available, they were creating these credit default swaps and stuff, and people were betting against the viability of somebody paying off a mortgage. And some of these investment houses, the big investment banks, were actually betting against their own stuff, and there are all kinds of deception, but they're looking for a place for that money. And from an economist standpoint, an economist considers something an investment only if you're actually producing new productive capacity. If I buy a factory, then that's new investment. If I own a laundry and I buy a delivery truck or a new washing machine, that's an investment that an economist would say. But this stuff that gets passed off as an investment is just gambling, it's just speculation, and it's not real investment because it does not add to productive capacity. You're buying each other's paper and creating a bubble.
Up to a point, financial investment is investment because there's some information generated, but it goes way past, but these bubbles go way past that. And so what happens with public investment, two things happen. One, you've got the public investment, as you say, it creates more jobs. So just the creation of more jobs, more demand for labor. So on the one hand, slightly less inequality, so there are more investment opportunities. At the same time, if you're getting the money for that public investment from the rich, you're also having less money there for them to so that they aren't as desperate for these scam opportunities because you've taken some off the top. So you're actually better off. In a way, the rich are even better off being more highly taxed because you're taking money away that they would otherwise gamble away.
Right. And so again, to go back to your theme of the inequality, these bubbles, although the rich keep throwing their money into these bubbles, when they bust, they actually hurt the poor. I mean, it's like poor people that got squeezed out of their homes through foreclosure. The rich banks got bailed out, and nobody went to jail even for the things that were grossly criminal. They're just not even being prosecuted. The banks that were too big to fail are considered too big to prosecute. So they get away scot-free, and the ordinary people who got victimized by it, the powerless at the bottom of the power differential, they got hurt. So let's move on to something else that's been talked about, which is the carbon tax. People who talk about a market-based, people who are generally relatively conventional and conservative believe in market-based solutions. And one of the things that would flow for that would be a tax on carbon, a tax on oil or coal or whatever that burn. And a lot of environmentalists say, let's send a price signal so that people who burn too much oil or coal or natural gas, whatever, have to pay for that. And there's some ins and outs of this that go beyond most people's thinking. Tell us something about that.
Okay. Well, first of all, we do need a carbon tax, and one reason is what's called the rebound effect. What happens is, suppose we do massive public investment and do other things that reduce the use of fossil fuels, and you don't have a carbon tax. What's going to happen? Well, you drastically lower the use of fossil fuels. You're going to see the price of those fossil fuels drop. And at that point, what's going to happen is somebody will find a new use for them. Nobody's burning coal to make electricity. Hey, we can take coal and make plastic out of it and build houses out of it. Or we can put things in your driveway to warm your driveway and melt the snow off the driveway. They actually sell those, by the way.
Right, I've heard of that.
That's a real thing. And so on. And so there are other things, there are other reasons for a carbon tax, but here's the thing. It's fine as reinforcement, it's fine as a supplement to public investment and some other things we can do, but here's what's wrong with doing it as the main thing. A carbon tax, if you're going to do a carbon tax, you have to measure emissions accurately, and you have to measure them not just nationally, internationally, which we can do. You have to measure them at the local level. In other words, if the U.S. is producing a bunch of carbon emissions, and you can go into the air and look at the concentration, we can determine that pretty quickly, pretty accurately. But if you want to tell which house is producing its share or which car, not as easy. And usually the advocates of carbon tax say, well, you know, you tax the fuel. But the problem is a gallon of gasoline is not the same as every other gallon of gasoline. A lump of coal is not the same as every other lump of coal. A million cubic feet of natural gas is not the same as every other million cubic feet of natural gas. And two examples of this is one, you know, the ETS is the European trading system is probably the most rigorous carbon price scheme in the world. It's a carbon trading scheme, but at least it's the most rigorous one out there. But several people have found that if you take different types of measurements of emissions, you have differences of up to 50% in the ETS. Another example is in the United States, we have power plants, you know, electricity power plants, where you have some of the most rigorous measurements of emissions on this planet. On the one hand, you have actual meters on the smokestacks, and while they measure other things besides carbon dioxide, they happen to measure carbon emissions. And on the other hand, the fuel going into the plant is not just measured in gallons or BTU or MCF or pound or tons. The EPA actually divides fuel into more than 50 different grades of fuel with different emissions factors for it. And even with that, they found that you have, there have been some peer-reviewed studies in 2008 that showed you have accurate, in precision of plus or minus 25%, 30%, in some cases as little as 13%. And here's the thing. The most radical emissions reduction scheme ever proposed, which was by Bolivia, was to lower emissions by 10% per year. So we can't measure power plant emissions, which is something you can measure more accurately than anything else, with even that precision. It's less precise than even that. And your typical scheme is 5%. So you're measuring at 13%, 17%, 25%,
Yeah,
and the emission reduction is 5%, and that's with power plants. What do you think our accuracy and precision is with households
Yeah.
or cars
Yeah.
or small factories?
So how could we do a carbon tax or carbon pricing efficiently? How's the
Well, you
how's
can't
the right
do it
way?
efficiently,
Or
but
how can you do it effectively?
you can do. The answer is you do it as you do it as a rough and ready measure. In other words, you do put a tax on fuel. You put a tax on where it's mined or extracted or pumped or imported, but you don't rely on it. You say, okay, this is a really approximate rough and ready measure. It's reinforcement. You just and you know the price of something goes up. The demand will go down somewhat, and it prevents the rebound effect. And it does have some effect, but it's just, but you've got to, it's not a primary driver.
Yeah.
It's just a way of reinforcing other methods. And so the thing is, you do it, but you acknowledge how rough and ready and imprecise it is, and so you acknowledge that it's reinforcement, and you don't depend on it. You put your emphasis on other measures, and you do this and you do the carbon tax, the carbon fee as a secondary measure.
Okay, that seems reasonable. I mean, as you're talking about the difficulty of getting a good, accurate measurement, I was thinking, how accurately does the income tax system that we have measure people's ability to pay? I think this is probably way lower in accuracy. I mean, there's more screwiness in the income tax system in this country than in the carbon tax, and yet, despite everybody's griping, we still put up with that.
Right. Well, it's not a question of whether you put up with it, but nobody is depending on the income tax as your primary way of shaping behavior or accomplishing things. We actually do have a lot of things in the income tax to shape a behavior, and they don't work that well.
Right.
The income tax is a good way of raising revenue. Usually when you have these loopholes to shape behavior, you end up with a lot of results you don't really want.
Right, and not getting what you do want. I put a lot of money into some energy conservation stuff at my house and found out I couldn't deduct any of it because I had taken something of a similar kind the year before, and I was not able to do it for this year. So the money I spent, I mean, I would have done the money anyway for the energy conservation stuff at the house in this second year anyway, regardless of the tax credit, but I thought I'd get a tax credit out of it. No, I didn't. So I mean, yeah, it's a screwy system overall as far as shaping behavior, but everybody says, oh, let's give a tax credit for this or that. And the state legislature here in Washington has been struggling with all these loopholes that have gone on for years and years, and they can't stop them.
Right.
So let's move on to something that you've referred to as social consumption, and maybe you're not the only person to use that term, but we typically in this country think about economic consumption in terms of individual behavior. You know, so I buy a pair of shoes and I wear them until they wear out, or I buy a loaf of bread and I eat that, or it's individual consumption. And tell us what you mean by the term social consumption and how that's a good way to be thinking.
Public consumption usually paid for by the government, although there are education. You go to a school, that's a social consumption.
Okay.
A publicly funded daycare center, that's public consumption. Social Security, that's public consumption. Basically, public spending. And if you think about it, people think, oh, it's waste or it's dead weight, but public consumption, just like private consumption, are things we want. People want their kids educated. Yeah. If you go to work, people need some place to leave. If both parents, or if you're a single parent household going to work, you need a place to leave your kid. And if you can have a publicly funded daycare center, instead of having to spend a huge percentage of your wages on daycare, that's a huge plus. And most people, I think, are glad to have publicly funded education rather than having to send their kids to private schools or have them turn out illiterate.
And that also provides a social justice and economic justice cushion in our society, because if you're rich, you can afford to send, whatever. If you're rich, you can afford to buy a lot of books, and people who are not rich can go to the library where the government has bought the books. We have a socialized library system. The government builds a building, fills it full of books, and people come and borrow the books and read stuff there for free.
Right, or you know that streetlights shine down on the just and unjust alike.
That's right. Yeah, it's just like the story in the Bible where it says the rain falls on the just and the unjust alike.
Okay, and the thing is, there have been public consumption, and here's an interesting thing, is actually when you're talking about public goods, stuff that tends to be underprovided if it's provided privately, actually adds to economic efficiency. For example, healthcare. You know that there have been a lot of statistics that show that single-payer healthcare provides better healthcare at a lower cost.
And that's
than private health.
basically like Medicare for everybody.
Medicare for all.
Socialized medicine has been called, but
or is it real socialized health insurance?
Right. Yeah.
And I can give you other examples, but I'll tell you, it has shown that how the countries with generous public pensions have higher economic growth rates than ones with parsimonious private parsimonious pensions. So so in general, public investment in public goods adds to economic growth.
It's also, stability also. It's like we're all in this together, and it's a buffer against extreme poverty or extreme bad luck that may befall somebody. Right. You get sick or whatever.
Another way of looking at it, we've talked a lot about infrastructure, wind generators and things.
Yeah.
Well, these are infrastructure too. Schools are social infrastructure.
Yeah.
Healthcare is social infrastructure. Pensions are social infrastructure.
Yeah.
Daycares, libraries, and so on. Those are infrastructure too.
Yeah. Let's talk about something that often comes up in these conversations about climate, which is the technological ways of solving the problem. Some of the things that we need to deal with for the climate are in the area of public policy, mostly the kinds of stuff we've been talking about, and social justice, economic justice, taxation, all these things we've talked about. We've not yet talked about the realm of technological solutions that a lot of people say, wow, here's the solution, or oh, there's the solution. And some of this stuff seems like quackery, and some of it is good, solid solutions. And I wonder if you can help us think through how to figure out which are real solutions. And you say that a lot of the technology actually exists for making good progress.
Oh yeah, we could reduce our emissions by something like 95% with today's technology very easily. Here's the fundamental thing. We know how to produce electricity renewably. To give two examples, wind turbines on commercially developable sites, that aren't wilderness or urban areas, could provide about 5 times as much electricity as electricity equal to 5 times as much energy, not just electricity, but our total energy consumption. Wind turbines could provide 5 times that electricity. Solar power on about 2% of desert land could provide electricity equal to 100% of the energy we consume worldwide. Again, that's energy, not just electricity. Yeah. Now, people say, oh, well, the wind doesn't blow all the time, the sun doesn't shine at night or in cloudy weather. Nope, but if you mix sun and wind, you get them from different areas with long-distance transmission. It gets much more reliable.
Yeah.
Then you add a little storage, and storage is expensive, but you don't need a lot of it. That gets more, and then you add a little bit of existing hydro and some geothermal for shaping, and that provides all the electricity. I'm not saying this is the best way, but there's an example of technology we have now that could provide electricity. Now, the other thing is a lot of our energy use isn't electricity, but it can be. What you have in buildings can be provided by electricity. Our ground transportation can be electricity. When you're talking about factories, about 70% of energy used industrially could be done from electricity. Then the other thing is the single biggest resource is efficiency. There are all sorts of ways of using energy more efficiently. And one of them is if you take areas where you're using fossil fuels and you substitute electricity for it, you can use that electricity in many cases more efficiently than the fossil fuels. Another thing is you can do things like insulation. You can do things like building trains to passenger trains. Another example is if you electrified and improved our freight rail, we can move 85% of what's currently being carried on heavy trucks on freight trains.
Right.
And that would be a good thing to use trains for instead of carrying coal.
Right, and that would also have the benefit of wearing out less on the roads and highways, because the trucks, which are so heavy, just beat the crap out of the highways, and they cause more damage and more need for repairs and resurfacing.
Right.
Then if we can get those trucks off the highways and carry that by a more efficient rail system, that would free up freeway lane space and city street, arterials for cars, so we don't feel the pressure to build more freeway lanes and don't have to resurface the
Also, something to
roads
remember
so much.
is a highway needs to be resurfaced every 7 years.
Yeah.
A rail line needs to be rebuilt every 40 years. And incidentally, that's another efficiency thing. Is, when we're talking about industrial efficiency, make goods last longer. You don't
Yeah.
have to build them as often. Use less packaging.
Right.
There's all sorts of things like make things repairable.
Yeah.
That's another way of saving
Right.
energy.
There are so many of these things, and these things require a grassroots movement. The politics, as usual, is not getting us where we need to go, and politics, for a number of reasons that are having to do with the corruption of the political system, but also just the underlying problems of atomization and inequality that we've talked about, making it hard to get politics to function right. But if we can have a grassroots movement from ordinary people, that seems like a more productive way to go.
But the one thing to remember is when we're talking about making changes this big, most people aren't concerned enough about the climate crisis to fight for this big a change for the sake of the climate. You're not going to have people say, oh, let's cut the military to save emissions. You're not going to have people say, let's tax the rich to save energy. But the thing is, you don't have to do it for that reason, because you have all these other problems that also come from atomization and inequality. So you can so investing in these things creates jobs. So here's something where labor unions and the women need jobs, so women's movement. Also, all the toxic waste affect women and children. So that's something you could have. You've got the peace movement, because these wars kill people. They're doing horrible things to we had this horrible bombing in the Boston Marathon. But if people in Pakistan are suffering Boston Marathon bombings once a week, every day, and they're under the threat of them all the time. So that's something. So there's a reason for not doing all this military spending.
Right.
In addition to, and so basically, here's the thing: if you want to solve the climate crisis, the people concerned with the climate crisis have to become part of a larger movement that fights against atomization and inequality. So the people who want to solve the climate crisis have to support the labor movement, have to support the peace movement, have to support the women's movement.
Right.
And I would say it goes the other way. If you're concerned about labor, you need to support the peace movement. You need to support the women's movement, the climate, civil rights. We need all these different movements to fight our own atomization, to get together, to build a larger movement that's concerned with fundamental change that isn't just a climate or environmental movement, that isn't just a labor movement, that isn't just a peace movement, but it's a movement to transform society. And the title of the chapter in my book, where I said is named after a song by the Ozark Mountain Daredevils. If you want to get to heaven, you've got to raise a little hell.
And it's one of these things where we're all in this together, and as you connect the dots, then the overwhelming majority of people ought to be able to realize we're all in this together, and with enough of us, then that's a critical mass, and that's what it takes. So I want to put in a plug for the books that we've been talking about, and then for the organizations working on this. We're running tight on time, but I want to make sure people know that Solving the Climate Crisis Through Social Change is just fascinating. It has this kind of information and a whole lot more. It's very well documented. I'm so much impressed that it covers such a wide range of issues and hooks everything together. And this one that you also produced uses graphic imagery. It's a quick read, and it's not as thorough, of course, as the hardbound book, but very good at laying out the issues in ways that people can understand. I want to make sure people know that the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation has a group working on the climate called Confronting the Climate Crisis. We've been pushing on this since 2012. We meet monthly. The Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation's website has a whole page with a lot of information on the climate crisis. Visit olympiafor.org and click on the climate crisis link. And you can email us at the climate group by doing climate@olympiafor.org. I want to thank our guest, Gar Lippo. It's been fun to talk with you. It's always exciting. There's so many good ideas to bounce around, and all the things connect. I want to thank all the folks who've been watching. When people want to solve the climate crisis, some people like change light bulbs and let it go at that. And there are so many more dimensions to the problem and so many more possibilities for the solution. As Gar's research and writing shows, a lot of the solutions to the climate crisis would be very good for us as in additional ways. Conservation is important, but we need technological and political and economic and social changes. And all of that is interconnected, and we can build the synergy to make things move better. When the Japanese military attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941, the United States mobilized, and we changed our whole economy. Instantaneously, we stopped building civilian vehicles and geared up for the war effort. We rationed scarce commodities. We did a bunch of stuff because the need was serious and urgent. We need to do that now. So I appreciate the work that is in these books and the information that Gar has shared with us. I appreciate what people are doing throughout our community and beyond and around the world. You can get information about peace and justice issues through the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation. We all share one human planet. We all need to pitch in and help out, and the world needs you. Thanks. Let's start with an example that we might draw a lesson from in a bit later. When a house or apartment is not well insulated, heat leaks out and it wastes energy. When we burn fuel to reheat the house or apartment, we waste fuel and put more carbon dioxide, CO2, into the atmosphere, and this disrupts the climate. Many apartment buildings are poorly insulated. What are the realities for the tenant and for the apartment owner?
For the tenant, there's the fact that no tenant knows for sure how long they're going to stay. So a tenant doesn't want to make a huge investment in insulation that could just end up being a gift to the landlord. And the reality for the landlord is the landlord doesn't want to make a investment that would save the tenant money. So you end up with what's called a split incentive, where neither the tenant nor the landlord has enough incentive to properly insulate that apartment.
Okay, so people can like stash that away in their minds, and I want to see, can we generate another example on the same principle, and people can store that in their way in their minds until we can connect the dots.
Okay, well, it's also true that houses that are owner-occupied are often under-insulated. And a reason for that is that a homeowner doesn't have as easy access to capital, and it caused horrible back injuries, lifelong back injuries. A lawyer representing the farm workers tried it and had to see what it was like and had to give up after a few hours. He couldn't stand the pain. So the UFW, United Farm Workers Union, led a movement to outlaw the short-handled hoe in the lettuce fields. And the lettuce growers said, hey, wait a minute, you outlaw the short-handled hoe, we'll go bankrupt. The lettuces won't be weeded right. But the farm workers won, and here's an interesting thing. The day the short-handled hoe was outlawed, Bud Antle, the major lettuce grower at the time, admitted productivity went up 10%. So the important thing here, of course, is not that productivity went up 10%, but that a hideous cruelty was ended. But it's interesting that happened because one of the side effects was that if lettuces were weeded more efficiently, that it turned out that you're not wasting pesticides growing lettuces that have to be thrown away, damaged. You're not wasting truck fuel because it takes truck fuel to get farm workers from the labor camps to the fields, fertilizer, and so on. And so it actually saved emissions. No one was thinking about that, but it did. But an interesting thing is, why did the lettuce growers not know that this would happen as a utility? So a utility can borrow money at a very low interest rate. A homeowner will often have to borrow money at a much higher rate. And in addition, because a homeowner has limited ability to borrow, they have to say, hey, wait a minute, what if the roof leaks? What if I lose my job? All the possibilities. And so homeowners are reluctant to borrow money and add to their debt to produce savings over the long run. And if you don't mind, that doesn't apply just to homeowners, but in general, even applies to businesses too. Businesses cannot afford to spend as much to save energy as a utility can afford to spend to generate it.
Okay, so different entities have different constraints, incentives, different financial realities. Let's look at something that's in a different angle, and the viewers can stash that away in their minds until we connect the dots a bit later. Tell us about the short-handled hoe that lettuce farmers used to require farm workers to use. Short-handled hoe is, for anybody who's doing work in the yard, a hoe that you can stand up on of a normal length is one thing, but a hoe that's so short you have to stoop over is awful.
The short-handled hoe is called El Cortito, the devil's arm. It was 18 inches long. And so to pull lettuce with that, farm workers, to pull weeds in the lettuce fields, farm workers had to bend and stoop.
I'm Glenn Anderson with the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation. For more than 26 years, this TV series has explored a wide variety of issues that relate to peace, social justice, and nonviolent social change. The science is settled. The climate crisis is real. And human behavior, burning wood and more recently especially fossil fuels, has caused it. This month's TV program goes past the obvious causes to examine some causes that are not usually recognized. And these unrecognized sources of the problem are also unrecognized solutions. During this hour, we will explore social and economic justice, real imbalances of power as part of the problem, and we'll explore how correcting the imbalances of social and economic power can help reduce the climate crisis. Our guest, Gar Lippo, is a researcher and writer with wide-ranging knowledge across very diverse subject matter. He's highly skilled at connecting the dots across issues to identify problems and propose solutions. He's written several books, including Solving the Climate Crisis Through Social Change, which we'll refer to tonight in this conversation. It'll be a fascinating hour, and we will learn a lot. I'm delighted to welcome Gar Lippo as a guest. Good to have you here. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
All right. Welcome.